All right, welcome to today's Courageous Conversations. We do have closed captioning enabled, so if you'd like to use that, please click on the CC icon with the live transcript. Okay, so today I'd like to welcome you all, and we are doing another round of Sunrise Communities with a slight twist, and Reverend Ernestine Flemister will be introducing our guest speaker in a moment. For now, I'd like to say that we also have Reverend Tom Berry with us from Bethany Presbyterian Church. Reverend Ernestine is from St. Luke's Episcopal. Reverend Ryan Scott from Newman United Methodist was unable to join us today, sends his well wishes and ours to him. And Jenny Jackson and myself, Sally Snyder, we are here representing Rogue Community College. So thank you for joining us today. A little break from our normal beginning, we wanted to review what is allyship. It's becoming more and more important that we really stand up for each other. So being a friend, number one, being a friend, being an advocate, being supportive, being a careful listener, being respectful, being a researcher and learning, not being a savior, not stereotyping, being able to accept criticism even when it's not comfortable, being willing to work towards changing oppressive systems, and being brave. So this is a partial list of what is being an ally. And then there's 5 Ds of allyship. So of course, you're welcome to connect with us at any time to go over those in detail, but just as a quick review, the 5 Ds are documenting. You can write something down, photograph, video can be very helpful. Later, delegating, talk to someone who may be in a better position to help with the situation or call 911 if necessary. Directly intervene in a situation. Always be safe, always, and carefully consider the best way to intervene. Distract, one that I'm really good at, create a distraction to interrupt a situation. Diverting attention can be very effective. And finally, delay. If you can't take action in the moment, if others aren't receptive, you can still make a difference and talk with the person after the fact. Ask how you can help. It's not just always in the moment, it can be later. And then I also wanted to go ahead and give an announcement now that next month for Pride Month, our Courageous Conversations will be on June 28th, Tuesday from noon to 1 as always. And with that, I am now going to ask Reverend Ernestine to speak and to introduce Taylor for us. Ernestine.
Thank you, Sally. Welcome, everybody. Taylor has been with us before, and Taylor is a graduate of Portland University, and he grew up in a conservative Republican household. Taylor discovered his voice to fight for justice during a postgraduate trip to the South for the first time. And he visited Mississippi, the Interactive Civil Rights Museum. He noticed how the attention was focused on the revolutionary actions and sacrifices of everyday people, not the recognizable civil rights icons. He also visited Alabama, where he was inspired by listening to a recorded record of Dr. Martin Luther King's speech of the fierce urgency of now. Then he spent hours in Montgomery's National Memorial for Peace and Justice, where the acknowledgement of over 4,400 Black men, women, and children who were lynched, shot, beaten to death or burned alive between 1877 and 1950. Among the victims' names, Stewart found his family name listed. And so that began the fire in Stewart to fight for freedom and justice, and to bring it to the attention of all of us who may not be so much aware of it. And so it is with great pleasure that I present to you again, Taylor Stewart. Welcome, Taylor.
All right, I have a number of tabs open. I'm just looking for where I'm at. Okay? You and I are going to have a difficult conversation, but I promise you that if we get through the difficult parts of this story, there's a better ending waiting for us on the other end. 4 years ago, I set out to reconcile the lynching of a man named Alonzo Tucker, the most widely documented African-American victim of lynching in Oregon. Alonzo Tucker was 28, married, and a boxer from California. He was lynched in Coos Bay, Oregon in 1902 after being wrongfully accused of sexually assaulting a white woman before he was eventually hung from a light pole on the old Marshfield Bridge in front of a crowd of 300. Even children were a part of the lynch mob that left Alonzo Tucker's body hanging there for several hours. Despite this all occurring in broad daylight without a masked man in the crowd, no one would ever be held accountable for his killing. Alonzo Tucker was just one of the thousands of African Americans who were lynched in this country. So, how do you reconcile a lynching? How do you find justice for historical injustice? Admittedly, 4 years ago, I was not the person who would answer such a question. In fact, I had spent most of my life actively avoiding all topics of race because I felt I didn't have the words or ability to contribute to these conversations. So when I first heard about the national movement to memorialize African American lynching victims, I figured to myself, who am I to really think that I could be of any help? I was too intimidated to want to get involved. But thankfully, a John Lewis quote inspired me to change my mind. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? This inspired me with the fierce urgency of now. By simply asking the question, how do you reconcile lynching, and being willing to search for an answer, I've learned that there are 3 R words within this idea of reconciliation: remembrance, repair, and redemption. And that in order for us to get to that last R word of redemption, we need to have the courage to undertake the first 2. Because what I've also learned is that our failure to remember and repair our history is what allows injustices like lynching to continue on into today. And so it has become my life's mission to help other individuals and communities ask their own questions about reconciling historical harm. In 2018, I first reached out to the community of Coos Bay to try and help me begin this process of reconciliation with a series of acts of remembrance. When I tell older African Americans from the Portland area that I'm traveling to Coos Bay or other regions of Southern Oregon, they without fail always ask me 2 questions. How many people am I going with? And am I prepared to defend myself? Because even in 2022, these questions are still on the forefront of their minds because of Oregon's history of fear and intimidation towards Blacks. Southern Oregon was not the most likely place for this work to begin. In fact, 4 years ago, most people thought I was out of my mind for thinking I could put a historical marker about lynching in Coos Bay, Oregon. But what Coos Bay taught me is that no matter where you go, you can find enough people who are willing to choose justice if given the opportunity. It's just a matter of getting them to see where there's been injustice. That's not to say there wasn't a reasonable reluctance at first to want to remember something as painful as a lynching. But what Coos Bay was eventually able to see is that while we can't change the past, we can always change our relationship to the past, and that they had the power to write a new ending to Alonzo Tucker's story. In 2020, we held a soil collection ceremony near the spot of the lynching and collected 2 jars of soil, with each bit of soil telling part of Alonzo Tucker's story. One jar was sent back to a museum in Montgomery, Alabama, and the other jar is now on display at the Coos History Museum. In 2021, we unveiled a historical marker in the community to memorialize Alonzo Tucker and the thousands of other African Americans who were lynched in this country. The historical marker was more than just a retelling of history, it was also the making of history, as over 600 people, double that who were at the 1902 lynching, gathered at the unveiling ceremony to add this new chapter to Alonzo Tucker's story. So, as meaningful as these acts of remembrance were, the lynching of Alonzo Tucker has not yet been reconciled, because remembrance alone is not enough to get to redemption. We need repair. We need to put an end to the harm that lynching continues to cause today. In this case, we are called to repair the fundamental question of who our society believes deserves death, because the answer continues to be people that disproportionately look like me, like Alonzo Tucker. The value of our lives is tied up in this question. The value of all African Americans is tied up in this question. Our failure to remember and repair the legacy of lynching is what has allowed it to evolve. Lynching never ended. It simply moved indoors, where all white juries and expedited trials carried out the same verdict as the lynch mob. Because at the same time lynchings in the United States were going down, state-sanctioned executions were going up. During the 1930s, 2/3 of all executions in the United States were of African Americans. Between 1910 to 1950, while only making up 22% of the South's population, African Americans accounted for 75% of all of those who were executed in this region, and this disproportionality continues to today, where African Americans make up 13% of the population, but 41% of those who are on death row. And when we consider the fact that of that 41%, nearly all are African American males, yet African American males only make up 6.5% of our population, we have to ask ourselves, how do we get from 6.5 to 41%? The color of your skin still plays a crucial role in whether our society believes you deserve death or not. We have been too busy asking ourselves the question, does this person deserve to die for their crimes, that we haven't first asked ourselves the question, do we deserve to kill? Because if the answer is no, then it doesn't matter what the answer is to that first question. Did you know Germany doesn't have the death penalty? Germany knows that given their history, it would be unconscionable for the country of Germany to systematically execute its citizens, especially if a disproportionate number of those citizens were Jewish. The world would be in outrage. We in the United States would be outraged if that were the case. Yet where is that same outrage when, given our history, the United States systematically executes its citizens and a disproportionate number of those citizens are African American? Where is the outrage when, given our history as a state, a disproportionate number of African Americans sit on Oregon's death row? Because I don't hear any outrage. 4 years ago, I set out to reconcile the lynching of Alonzo Tucker, and that is still my goal. I've just learned along the way that reconciliation requires more than remembrance. But I can't find this reconciliation on my own. We have a responsibility to the history that we inherit, and that history is calling for us to end the death penalty in Oregon. So we need to be outraged over injustice. We need to address this moral question of our time. We need to get our friends, our family, and the wider community of Oregon to be inspired by the fierce urgency of now. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? We need remembrance and repair so that we can hopefully one day bring this story to a place of redemption. When I was younger, I used to think that it was remarkable people that did remarkable things, but the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that it's remarkable things that make remarkable people, and I believe that you can be a part of something that's remarkable. By using repair and Alonzo Tucker's story to end the death penalty in Oregon, we can bring his memory a semblance of redemptive justice, the kind of justice that redeems our pain, our wrongdoing, and our stories. People ask me if I really think this connection between lynching and the death penalty will change hearts and minds. Well, let me tell you, I know it does because it changed my mind. I wasn't always this person. I graduated high school with the dream of becoming a tough on crime prosecutor. I used to be a passionate supporter of the death penalty. I gave a speech my junior year of college in favor of capital punishment, and I'm not that old, so that wasn't that long ago. I've always cared about justice. But then I learned about lynching and I learned about its connection to the death penalty. And I realized that there is no justice unless there's equal justice. Equal justice under law. That's what it says on the Supreme Court. But our system that we depend upon to dispense the most ultimate form of justice is too flawed to produce anything but injustice. I would say it's broken, but it's functioning exactly the way it was intended, as a replacement for lynching. I need redemption too. So, how do we reconcile lynching? We remember their stories, we repair the fundamental question, and we redeem their legacy. None of our stories are over. My story is not over, Kuzbei's story is not over, and most importantly, neither is Alonzo Tucker's. We all need redemptive justice, and Alonzo Tucker's story needs one more chapter, an end to lynching in Oregon. Because right now, when we talk about Alonzo Tucker, we talk about the legacy of lynching. Well, I need your help so that one day when we talk about lynching, we're talking about the legacy of Alonzo Tucker. Thank you. So thank you all very much. And what we'll sort of do in this next part of the conversation is how can we apply this model of reconciliation, of remembrance, repair, and redemption to Grant Pass's history, specifically the history of sundown communities. And so I'll pass it back to Sally or Ernestine, and they'll kick off us in discussion.
Thank you, Taylor. You know, I want to clap for you for the words you're saying, and at the same time, it's a struggle because I don't want to clap about what it's about, but where it's going for sure. So I would just want to open up the conversation for people to react and respond. Something I hear a lot, like I even heard today when telling people about what's happening, they're like, they don't want to talk about it. Well, that's just digging it up. And when you talk about this stuff that happened, that's just prolonging it. And it's not really helping us move forward. And I said, aha, however, come to this and listen about how we do need to be able to talk about our past and be able to reconcile with it so we can move forward in a positive fashion. So just a simple question, what has caught your attention? Like what really stood out for you today? And please just feel free to unmute your microphone. Or if you'd like to raise your hand, that's also good.
I think what stuck out for me in what Taylor said this morning was that the death penalty serves as a replacement for lynching. And I think it's, when you think about it, it's so very relevant for us because it's a legal way of getting around doing something that's illegal. And so our silence on allowing this continues to happen. It speaks volumes about us. And with regards to what Taylor was saying about Germany and them not allowing anything, one of the other things that I so admire about what Germany does that we do not do is they're teaching the history of the Holocaust. Every student in Germany has to learn about the Holocaust, and every student has to visit a site where the Holocaust happened. They're not trying to bury it and make excuses for not knowing the truth of their history. So I think that's something that we need to do, and especially in light of what happened in Buffalo. And I have to say that we hear only about Buffalo, but there were two other places on the same Sunday where they had mass shootings in this country. And so we continue to be silent about things that really, as Taylor says, there's no outrage about it. And we need to be outraged about these things.
I will say that one thing that really stuck out for me from what Taylor said was one phrase that I wrote down, which was, we have a responsibility to the history that we inherit. And I think that really, for me, just speaks to the importance of looking at painful history, because you can't be responsible to something if you don't know it or understand it. And so that's going to sit with me for a long time, Taylor. Thank you. And yeah, it's given me a lot to think about, but also a way to kind of move forward for myself so that I'm doing more and not just thinking about it.
Taylor, when you first started in Coos Bay, could you talk about the reception? What obstacles you ran into when you first started bringing this up?
And still talk when I'm on mute. It's been 2.5 years, still happens. But similar to what you had previewed at the start was the sort of, why would we want to talk about this? 4 years ago, they weren't like, yes, kid from Portland, we would love to put up a historical marker about a lynching in our community. And so the variant is that that sort of, why would we want to talk about it? These sort of histories make us feel powerless. We inherit this history, and then there's the feeling of like, well, there's nothing I can do about it. But it is changing that mindset to give people the idea that they do have power, and that they can add these new chapters to history. And when it comes to the story of Alonzo Tucker, what I tell people is that there are two dates of significance on the historical marker: 1902, when the lynching occurred, and 2021, when the historical marker was unveiled, and that we can't understand Alonzo Tucker's story only focusing on the 1902 date, as his story now continues on into 2020 and 2021, when that same community where his lynching occurred used his memory as inspiration for becoming a community more committed to the ideals of truth, justice, and reconciliation. And so it was that initial reluctance, the why do we want to talk about this? This is going to we can't do anything about. This is just going to be a painful resuscitation of history. But if the people who were able to come to the historical marker unveiling, it was actually a somber but joyous occasion, because the people that were there were able to add this new chapter so that Alonzo Tucker's story doesn't have to end back there. 4 years ago, if you had Googled Oregon or Coos Bay lynching, you would have gotten a variety of news stories in the last 3 decades that were like, did you know a lynching occurred in Oregon? But now if you Google Coos Bay or Oregon lynching, Google populates all the news stories about the reconciliation work. And so it's the idea of, because originally the fear was, why would we want to be known as the community where a lynching occurred? Why would we want to advertise that? But instead of being known as the community where lynching occurred, Coos Bay gets to be known as the community where reconciliation happened. And so it's that idea of, if we do the difficult of the remembrance and the repair, there is something better waiting for us on the other end. And so it takes courage to take those first few steps, but that's what we were able to do. And some of the biggest antagonistic figures at the start, by the end, were some of the biggest supporters, because they were able to see the sort of positive impact in this community. And we're able to see that after their fear, there was something better waiting for us.
Thank you. I see Randolph, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yes, hi. Do we have a good connection?
We do. We can hear you great. Thanks.
Yes, I've been grappling with that question of why dredge up the past when it's so dark. And a writer has been supplied language in a very brief paragraph that has been really helpful to me. I don't know if you know this author, Rebecca Solnit, Hope in the Dark. She wrote it after the US invasion of Iraq, and then it was reprinted after Trump was elected in 2016. She's been an activist for racial justice and other good things, and she's a brilliant writer, and she talks about the necessity of understanding our past to create a real hope. So hopefully I can read this so that you can understand it. Is it okay for me to read it, or okay?
Yes, please.
Memory produces hope in the same way that amnesia produces despair, the theologian Walter Brueggemann noted. It's an extraordinary statement that the theologian made, one that reminds us that though hope is about the future, grounds for hope lie in the records and recollections of the past. We can tell of a past that was nothing but defeats and cruelties and injustices, or of a past that was some lovely golden age now irretrievably lost. Or we can tell a more complicated and accurate story, one that has room for the best and the worst, for atrocities and liberations, for grief and jubilation. A memory commensurate to the complexity of our past and the whole cast of participants. A memory that includes our power produces that forward-directed energy called hope. For some reason, that just seemed to strike it at the heart of the necessity of remembering both the good and the bad.
Thank you for sharing that, Randolph. Is there anybody else? It's funny how you kind of sense who you think might want to be talking. And it looks like we just lost Amy. I thought she was going to say something. Okay, so here in Grants Pass and Southern Oregon, we've been talking about our history as a sundown town and wanting to transform ourselves to a sunrise community. And Taylor is working with us and helping us there's extra meetings outside of this to become part of that project. And Taylor, would you also like to speak to that?
Yeah. So it's similar to sort of bringing that same how do you reconcile history of a sundown town, with the idea that we first start with this remembrance work, which we're trying to do to educate both ourselves and our community about what were sundown towns, that these were more painful histories than just you weren't really necessarily allowed to stay here. Very many times it was violence that enforced and created sundown communities. And so we're doing this remembrance part to sort of then look at the ways that that history of racial exclusion is still relevant to us today. What does it mean to repair racial exclusion? To look at the ways that people of color still inhabit these spaces, and to reckon with their experience, that there are still remnants of this history that need to be addressed in order for us to get to that idea of redemption, that vision of a sunrise community, the opposite to a sundown town. And my hope is that we fast forward 20, 30 years, and people aren't ashamed of their history of a sundown town because they know that places that used to be sundown towns are particularly committed to these ideas of welcoming and inclusivity because of that history. And my hope is that places that used to be sundown towns are really able to adopt this vision of a sunrise community, so that that history isn't painful, but is instead the reason why we sort of are doing this work. And because we are intentional, it actually is able to create that vision. And so my hope is that 30 years from now, people can advertise themselves as a sunrise community, that they did the remembrance, they did the repair, and it then created this sort of new community state. And so looking to do that in the Grants Pass area, hopefully then creating a blueprint for other communities in Oregon and then across the country. And so I'm excited about what we're starting here, and I hope to continually update you all here at Courageous Conversations about the ways that we can get involved. One such thing that we're working on currently is, since we're in the remembrance portion, the research on what sundown towns look like, collecting local stories, and sort of showing the way that that sort of exclusion evolved into the present. And so that includes, like, when you have this sort of foundation of racial exclusion, things like the Ku Klux Klan are able to proliferate. And so how does that history sort of translate into today? And also wanting to collect oral history. Sundown towns are a phenomenon that people still living today have firsthand memories of. And so collecting the history of those who remember their community as a sundown town, as well as collecting the experience of African Americans who have navigated sundown towns in Oregon, to collect both the history, the effect, as well as there is resiliency associated with this history. And so as we look at the difficult part, there is the narrative of exclusion, but underneath it is also the narrative of exclusion, those in the community who have tried to create that inclusive space. And so the hope is that as these two narratives are happening simultaneously, we can create the inclusivity one to become the predominant narrative. And so I'm excited about what we are potentially able to do in Grants Pass. And I welcome you all to take an active role in creating this vision of a sunrise community.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and put my email in the chat. I can connect you with, it's funny, I've started to combine Gabby's names, but I believe it's Gabby Johnson. Yes, I do things with her middle and her last name to create whole new names for her. But we have an equity project here in Southern Oregon. And if you're interested in doing more and being part of that, I can certainly get you connected with those folks. Thinking back, Taylor, I used to be a proponent of the death penalty. Growing up, you know what you know. And then I read the book Dead Man Walking, and that absolutely changed my thinking completely around. And for you, it's only been a few years that you went from, these different places, and I think it's, I mean, that's, what can we do? What can you tell us that we could do to be active on this if we wanted to help express our outrage, and go ahead, and what can we do to address this problem?
Yeah. So the simplest way, so there's a quote from New Jersey Senator Cory Booker that I really love of, "Don't let your inability to do everything stop you from doing one thing." And so that one thing you can do on this issue is, so that talk I just gave, I'll be giving this Saturday at TEDx Portland, and then 3 to 5 weeks, yeah, Constance and Sylvia are going. It'll be exciting. There's 15 speakers, 6 musical acts. It'll be a full day event. But 3 to 5 weeks after the event, there will be a YouTube video of the talk. And so simply watching and sharing and getting others to do the same is how we change the world. We get this conversation going. And so once the YouTube video is up, I will pass it along to Sally and the folks at Courageous Conversations, and you'll be able to then share that video. And then if you get other people to share it as well, that is, that's the simplest way we actually go about making change on this issue, is simply providing people. I believe that most people are against the death penalty. They just don't realize they care. And so this is giving folks that reason of, this is why we care about this topic. And so the only way to actually end the death penalty in Oregon is through a statewide vote. And so we really do end the death penalty in Oregon one conversation at a time. And so sharing this video will be the way of starting those conversations.
Isn't there a bill coming up in the legislature about the death penalty?
So there was a bill in 2019 that limited the scope of the death penalty. There is not an upcoming bill in the state legislature. I am pushing with all my little might to inspire people with the fierce urgency of now, and that this is something we can actually move on. And so there is, so I'm like, I'm like, boom, let's do this 2024. Let's do this. Let's get this over with. But there is not quite that same optimism for victory amongst many people in the movement. And so my hope is that the sharing of this TED Talk and the creation of these new segments of people who care about this issue, and getting people to see that this is a racial justice issue, and in fact, a very important one, that there is the appetite and the actual ability, the political will to end the death penalty. And so my hope is that once the talk is up, and then the rest of 2022, if this movement can grow, we will be more likely to then push in 2023 for a voter referendum that would then happen 2024. And so the hope is to create a large enough movement for the rest of this year to inspire people with the belief that this can actually work.
Randolph, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Yes, a question for Taylor. I'm a longtime resident of Grants Pass, moved in here in '95. I understand this transformation of lynching into our present system of injustice in the prison system now. I understand that transition, but I'm not seeing that in Grants Pass. Is where is the transformation from that racial injustice that created the sundown town? How has that transformed into present day Grants Pass? I'm not seeing evidence of that. I'm relatively new to the idea of my right privilege, so I know I have much to learn about becoming a perceptive ally, even though I have great desire to be an ally in this cause. But I'm not seeing evidence of that transformation in present day affairs in Grants Pass. Can you give me clues on what to look for?
Yeah, so, you would find that evolution of sundown town history by talking to people of color in their community about their experience, sort of living in that space. I recently just came back from Pendleton, Oregon. I was at a rural Oregon conference, and Pendleton was also a former sundown town, and I had an experience there that reminded me of something that used to happen a lot more frequently when I was younger. Not so much anymore, but so I went to a distillery with my girlfriend, and there were these really long tables that were meant to hold multiple parties. And instead of sitting us at one of these larger tables in a better space, we got sat at the very, very back, sort of by the kitchen,
Wow.
in an undesirable space. And when I asked if we could move, they were like, no. And
Wow.
that reminded me of these experiences that I had when I was younger, of walking by table after table after table to get sat by the restroom. And so those little things that characterize the experience of people of color in much of Oregon is sort of how that history of a sundown town evolves. I read a book by a man. Randolph actually gave me the recommendation for this book. Is by a man named Dr. Robert Jackson, who recounted. So he lived in Grants Pass from like early 2000s to maybe like 2015, and he recounts. So this was early 2000s. On the second day that he moved into town, he went to Ace Hardware, or a hardware store, and he would, one of the managers helped him because he was getting stuff for his new home. And when he got in the checkout line, the manager of the hardware section told the guy behind him, he was like, "Harold, keep your eye on this one right here." And Harold was like, "Yeah, these people are always stealing." And so it's these little things, these experiences of people of color in former sundown towns that are sort of, if we have this foundation of racial exclusion and there is no intentional inflection point to change that, it's just going to continue. And so we learn more about how sundown towns evolve by hearing from the experiences of people of color. The book is called Racism in America, by Dr. Robert Jackson. And so that is sort of one of the things that we're doing with the Oral History Project, is to answer that question that Randolph had of, because this history of a sundown town is very culture climate based. You're like, how does that climate evolve? And so we show the way it evolves by collecting these stories of people's experiences. And so that, I believe, is sort of how the history evolved and sort of what calls our attention to, of how can we, make sure we have a community in which everyone feels safe, respected, and like they can call that space their home. And I believe that by doing that, we can create a better experience, not just for people of color, but people that share any sort of marginalized background, that really creates a better experience for the whole. And so one of the things is that, as we do this work in bringing up this history, it doesn't change who our community can become. This is just giving new information about the things we need to do to live out the ideals that we share. One of the things that I tell people is that I don't try to get people to see new values, but to see the values they already have in a new way. And so that's what we're hoping to do with this idea. I believe that most people want their neighbors to feel safe, respected, and they can call that space their home. And so here's us filling in some of the things that we need to do to actually create a community of the values that we want.
Can I comment, Taylor? Is it okay? Yeah. Since joining the Grants Pass Remembrance Project back in October, a number of us have been investigating the history of Grants Pass, looking for actual written history of being a sundown town, and it's largely been whitewashed. All we have basically is rumors, anecdotes, and a few references in Jane Lowen's book about sunrise towns or sundown towns. And the prevalent attitude in my community is we are no longer racist, that we don't have these attitudes, that we're incapable of even these microaggressions that you detailed in your own life. I am quite profoundly perplexed on how to encounter people. I don't even know how I was transformed myself to even considering the fact that I might have unhealthy attitudes toward different people. What do you find is helpful to invite people to consider that maybe they have unexplored dark regions in themselves?
So it is the whether we, the whole whether we like it or not, we have a responsibility to the history that we inherit. And so we inherit this history of racial exclusion. We inherit 400 legacy of anti-Black and anti-people of color racism. And so this climate exists everywhere. And so one of the things of like, a lot of people are like, oh, I don't see racism of, it's, it would be not the wisest if you were like, I'm white, therefore, like, I haven't experienced anti-Black racism, so I know it doesn't exist. You're like, if we want to know whether there's anti-Black racism, we should ask Black people. And Black people, anywhere you go, I can promise you will say there's racism. And so it is, how can we, and that's one of the things that we have been trying to move better forward in the sort of post George Floyd is, how can we not take our predominant mainstream experience of life in America and expect it to be the experience of everyone, but how can we listen to people of color and marginalized voices to better understand the experience, their experiences in the community? And so it's the, the question of, how do I find out more about the work that needs to happen in my community? Let me talk to people who are directly impacted. And so it's the, how can we form these conversations? And there's a whole other thing of like, people feeling sort of there's guilt isn't a necessarily negatively inherited emotion, but it's only negative if we get stuck there. And so it's the, you do have the power to impact this history. You can't change the history of a sundown town, but what you can change is the way that community exists today. And so it is, do people of color feel like they, so how can we create this vision of the community that we all want, and to better the experience of marginalized individuals in our community? The whole idea that we can't have a just community with the presence of injustice. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And and like white individuals can't have the dream of their community that they want if these things are happening. And so it actually is a benefit to everyone if we do these things so that we can truly live out the vision and the ideal for our community that we want.
Right, exactly.
I just wanted to say something. I need to have a different view here. I loved the way that you laid this out, starting with remembrance, because here in Josephine County and Jackson County, there's There's a movement against remembering. It would be much better for us just to forget it. Why do we need, like you were saying, why do we need to drag this up? And kind of what I hear you saying is, in the remembrance, we find the injustice, which opens our eyes to the way that we can proceed to justice. And without that being the basis, we don't get to do the next steps of repair and redemption. I also loved the way you talked about that this doesn't happen overnight, that it takes time. And so those are things that struck me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my so I have these sort of three cascading ideals of I'm not in the business of changing everyone, and that can't be our approach when we do many of the racial justice work. However, I do believe that we lose hope when we stop believing individuals and communities can change. So I choose to remain hopeful. And just because we can't change the whole doesn't mean we can't change a part. If whenever this death penalty vote goes on the ballot and I get my NRA diehard Trump Fox News Republican grandparents to vote out the death penalty in the name of racial justice, that's something. And just because you can't change that, there is this part, and it's this belief that regardless of where you're coming from, everyone can still choose justice once they learn about injustice. And so being pragmatic, but also continually hopeful. And so, you know, there was in the aftermath of George Floyd, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had a quote that really stuck in my mind. And he said, I'm caught in between hope and history. The idea that we have this hope of where we want to go, but because of our history, we haven't ever achieved that, even when we've had these moments of inflection. And so while that is true, I do think there's also an element of, I have hope because of our history, because we have been able to move things forward, and that there have been individuals who are able to be inspired by injustice to then push their communities towards justice. And so I do think we can hold those two things true. And that is the sort of why we also go back. Not everything in our history is painful. There are stories of hope embedded within these stories of injustice. And so how can we learn about, how can we continue those legacies? And so one of the things I talk about is to, like, when in schools, rather than teaching just about slavery, teach about the legacy of slavery, so that when we learn about figures like Harriet Tubman, we can figure out how to continue her legacy as these two things exist. And so there is the continual narrative arc of exclusion, but there has been that continual narrative arc of inclusion. And how can we make that the predominant one? And so I just stay optimistic and hopeful, because I do believe that most people want these and these places. And so it's that just not getting people to see new values, but their own values in a new way. And I do think we'll be able to do this in Grants Pass and Josephine County and other regions of Southern Oregon.
Thank you.
Okay, we're getting close to the end of our hour. Is there anybody who wanted to say something who's been holding back? I'm going to give a few moments. I'm always one to speak too much, so I want to open the floor to anybody who might want to share. Please go ahead, Dave.
I think an awful lot of this is awareness. And there was a period, I think 5 or 6 years ago, when I was reading everything I could find about not just history, but historical fiction that were based on history of things in Black history, Black culture. I know when I was trying to read this, I was looking for more to read, and I wasn't finding a whole lot, but there is stuff out there, and I don't have the names of the books that I've read in front of me, but I think making an effort to find those stories and just making yourself aware of not just what's in our white lily world, but there's another side to American history. That's all I have.
Thank you. Okay, and also checking out the chat, there's been a few things people have added. Let's see, there's an article, there's a link to an article about Does America Need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And then a song that was written in 1965, unequivocally objecting to the death penalty, a song called Iron Lady. I'm not sure how to pronounce the songwriter's name. I'm going to say Phil Oakes. I'm trying to read lips, Oakes, and I'm getting the nod. Thank you. I'm going to be looking that up and listening to it. Okay, so I want to thank you very much, Taylor, for joining us today, leading us through these difficult conversations. And I love the positivity you bring to us, because we definitely need that. We need to keep seeking each other out and leaning on each other and bringing our communities closer. And celebrating the things that can bring us together. So again, next month, we're going to be meeting on the 4th Tuesday, which I don't have up in front of me. What is it? Let's see. June 28th from noon to 1 with Pride as our topic. I hope everyone has a great day today. Thanks for joining us.